In rural West Virginia, a 64-year-old bookkeeper was about to overhear a conversation that would destroy her family. What started as an ordinary workday took a shocking turn when she discovered her children's betrayal. Margaret Caldwell wasn't your typical grandmother. For 35 years, she had secretly managed a multi-million-dollar trust fund while her ungrateful children treated her like hired help. When she overheard them planning her forced retirement and canceling her party to save money, she made a decision that would cost them everything. What began as family greed became the most expensive lesson in respect they'd ever receive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent light above Maggie Caldwell's desk flickered with the persistence of a dying moth, casting intermittent shadows across the ledger books that chronicled 3 generations of family struggle. At 64, she had learned to work through such distractions: flickering lights, leaking roofs, the constant hum of aging equipment fighting its inevitable surrender to rust and time. The Caldwell Coal Company office occupied a cramped corner of what had once been a proud industrial complex, now reduced to a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of unfulfilled promises. Maggie's pencil moved across the page with practiced precision, each figure representing another small hemorrhage in the family business. The numbers told a story her children refused to acknowledge: mounting debts, delayed payments, equipment repairs postponed until emergency became catastrophe. Yet these same ledgers held secrets that would have stunned anyone who bothered to look closely at her meticulous handwriting. She paused at David's latest entry: $1,200 charged to the company account for what the receipt described as business entertainment. Maggie recognized the Charleston restaurant's name. It was the same place where Ashley had posted Instagram photos of herself dining on oysters and champagne just 3 days ago. She made a careful note in the margin, her handwriting steady despite the familiar burn of resentment in her chest. The irony wasn't lost on her. While David complained about cash flow and Tommy worried about making payroll, she managed funds. That could have solved every problem the business faced, twice over. The Caldwell Family Trust, established by her late father-in-law in 1987, had grown quietly in her capable hands for 35 years. What started as a modest coal speculation, investment had transformed into a diversified portfolio worth just over $4 million. Her father-in-law's instructions had been clear and legally binding. The trust would remain secret until his son and grandchildren demonstrated the wisdom and character worthy of such responsibility. At the time, Maggie had assumed it was merely an old man's eccentricity. Now, watching her children's behavior, she understood it had been prophetic wisdom. The phone rang, startling her from her calculations. Jimmy Whittaker's familiar, gravelly voice carried through the receiver. "Maggie? Just wanted to go over those quarterly reports when you have a moment." "Of course, Jimmy." She glanced at the clock, nearly 5 o'clock. "I'll stop by after I close up here." "Good. The numbers are looking particularly healthy this quarter. Thought you'd want to know." Maggie understood his careful phrasing. Even after 20 years, Jimmy maintained the discretion that had made him the family's trusted attorney. The trust fund's existence remained known only to the two of them, bound by both legal obligation and unspoken understanding. The front door's bell chimed, and Tommy's familiar silhouette appeared in the frosted glass. She could tell from his posture, shoulders hunched, head slightly bowed, that he was carrying the weight of another family crisis. At 35, her youngest looked older than his years, worn down by trying to please everyone while satisfying no one. "Sorry I'm late, Mom." Tommy's voice carried genuine remorse as he hung his jacket on the door hook. Katie had one of her episodes this morning. Took forever to get her settled before school. Maggie softened at the mention of her granddaughter. Katie's struggles with anxiety had become more pronounced since her parents' financial stress had begun affecting the household. How is she doing? Better, I think, but you know how kids pick up on things. Tommy settled into the chair across from her desk, running his hands through thinning hair. Dr. Peterson thinks we should consider counseling, but the insurance. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maggie had quietly covered Katie's medical expenses more than once, funneling money through careful budget adjustments that Tommy never questioned. Another invisible act of support in a lifetime full of them. "We'll figure it out," she said simply. It was what she always said, and somehow things always did get figured out. Tommy never asked how. The sound of expensive tires on gravel announced David's arrival before his voice boomed through the thin walls. Maggie instinctively straightened, her body remembering decades of bracing for her eldest son's particular brand of demanding energy. At 42, David possessed his late father's height and broad shoulders, but none of the quiet strength that had once defined the Caldwell men. "Mom!" David's voice carried the impatient tone he'd perfected in childhood and never outgrown. "I need to talk to you about releasing some emergency funds." He strode into the office without knocking, his presence immediately shrinking the small space. Everything about David was calculated to project success: the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the carefully styled hair that was fighting a losing battle against genetics. Ashley followed a step behind, her designer handbag and manicured nails marking her as distinctly out of place in the utilitarian surroundings. "Emergency funds?" Maggie set down her pencil with deliberate care. "What kind of emergency?" "Ashley needs to get to Charleston for some shopping. Important stuff for the business, networking clothes, that sort of thing." David's explanation came out in a rush, as if speed could mask the weakness of his reasoning. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. In his chair, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere between his brother and the floor. Maggie recognized the look. Tommy knew this wasn't an emergency, but he also knew better than to challenge David directly. "The business account is for business expenses," Maggie replied evenly. "If Ashley needs clothes for networking, perhaps she should submit a proper expense report with documentation of the business purpose." Ashley's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Come on, Maggie, don't you think we're past all that bureaucratic nonsense? David's going to be running things soon anyway." The casual dismissal hit Maggie like a physical blow. Not Mrs. Caldwell. Or even Mom, just Maggie, as if 35 years of service to this family had earned her no more respect than a hired clerk. Worse was the assumption embedded in Ashley's words, that David's takeover was inevitable, decided without consultation or ceremony. "As long as I'm managing the finances, we'll follow proper procedures," Maggie said, her voice remaining steady, through sheer force of will. David's face flushed red, the color spreading up from his collar like a warning signal. "Proper procedures? Mom, you act like this is some Fortune 500 company instead of a dying coal operation in the middle of nowhere. We need to modernize, streamline operations. All this penny-pinching paperwork is exactly what's holding us back." "The paperwork is what keeps us legal and operating," Maggie replied quietly. "Something you might appreciate if you spent more time understanding how the business actually works." The silence that followed was charged with 35 years of accumulated tension. Tommy's fingers drummed nervously against his knee. Ashley examined her nails with exaggerated interest. David's jaw worked silently as he struggled between his desire to explode and his awareness that he still needed his mother's cooperation. For now. "Fine," David finally said, his voice tight, with controlled anger. "But this is exactly the kind of backward thinking that's going to change around here. Soon." He turned on his heel and stalked out, Ashley trailing behind with a look that mixed sympathy and superiority in equal measure. Neither bothered with goodbyes. Tommy remained in his chair, staring at the closed door. "He's really angry this time." Maggie resumed her work on the ledgers, but her hands trembled slightly as she wrote, "Your brother's anger is his own responsibility." "Mom." Tommy's voice carried a weight that made her look up. Maybe you should consider. I mean, David does have some good ideas about modernizing, and Ashley's got experience with business systems from her pharmaceutical days. The betrayal was gentle, wrapped in concern and delivered with love, but it cut deeper than David's bluster. Tommy wasn't malicious like his siblings, but his weakness accomplished the same result. When she needed an ally, he offered negotiations with her enemies. I see. Maggie closed the ledger and gathered her things. I should be getting home. We can discuss modernization another time. Tommy nodded eagerly, relief evident in his face. He never liked conflict, never wanted to choose sides. It was easier to believe that compromise was always possible, that everyone's needs could be accommodated if they just tried hard enough to understand each other. As Maggie walked to her aging Honda, she carried the weight of numbers that would never appear in any ledger. 35 years of sacrifice. 3 children raised while building a business and secretly growing a fortune that none of them appreciated or even knew existed. Decades of invisible labor that had kept them afloat while they attributed their stability to luck, good timing, or David's non-existent business acumen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Patterson. Pot roast tonight if you're interested. Made too much again. Maggie smiled despite her exhaustion. Eleanor's too much cooking was a decades-old fiction that allowed her to care for her friend without triggering Maggie's stubborn independence. Tonight, the offer felt like a lifeline. She typed back, "I'll bring the wine." As she drove through the familiar streets of her dying town, past abandoned storefronts and houses with "for sale" signs growing weathered in their yards, Maggie found herself thinking about foundations. The physical foundations of buildings, how they could support massive weight for decades before hairline cracks appeared. How those cracks could spread silently, invisibly, until the day the whole structure simply gave way. The Caldwell family had cracks running through its foundation, and she was the only one who could see them. The question that gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing day, was whether those cracks could be repaired, or if it was time to let the whole structure fall. The wine bottle sat unopened on Eleanor's kitchen counter as Maggie recounted the day's events, her voice steady but her hands betraying accumulated stress. Eleanor listened with 40 years of teaching patience. She knew when silence carried more weight than words. He called it backward thinking, Maggie said, staring into her untouched coffee. 35 years keeping that business afloat, and my ideas are backward. Eleanor's kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth, handmade quilts draped over chairs, mason jars of preserved vegetables lining shelves. The lingering scent of pot roast spoke to nurturing that Maggie rarely experienced in her own home anymore. You know what's backward? Eleanor's voice carried the edge that once made rebellious. Students straighten. Children who don't recognize sacrifice when it's staring them in the face. Maggie's phone buzzed. Family dinner Sunday, 6 p.m. We need to discuss business direction. From David. Not a request, a summons. Business direction, Eleanor snorted, reading over Maggie's shoulder. As if he knows which end is up. Sunday arrived with gray November drizzle that made everything look defeated. Maggie spent the morning preparing David's favorite pot roast, setting her mother's china, cloth, napkins requiring ironing afterward. Details no one would notice but would be criticized if absent. David and Ashley arrived first, their BMW incongruous in her modest driveway. Ashley's heels clicked against hardwood with staccato impatience as she surveyed the living room with barely concealed disdain. You really should update this place, Maggie, Ashley said, running manicured fingers along the mantelpiece. Fresh paint, new furniture, something more. Contemporary. The casual criticism landed like a slap. This house had been Maggie's sanctuary for 30 years, every piece chosen with care. Ashley's dismissal reduced decades of memories to aesthetic failures. I like it as it is, Maggie replied mildly. Of course you do, Ashley murmured, audible but deniable. Some people prefer living in the past. Linda arrived in controlled chaos, teenagers trailing with sullen resignation. Traffic was horrible, she announced, launching into familiar refrains about Mark's unemployment and mounting bills that never balanced, despite regular loans Maggie provided, and Linda never mentioned repaying. Tommy came last, apologizing for Katie's soccer practice. His daughter remained in the car, claiming homework, though Maggie suspected the girl had learned to avoid family gatherings that devolved into adult drama. Once seated, David cleared his throat with board meeting. Importance. We all know why we're here. The business needs new direction, and that means changes to operations. Maggie continued eating, attention sharpening. Cole's dying, David continued, warming to his theme. But we've got assets, land, equipment, community reputation. We could transition into environmental remediation, renewable energy consulting. Ashley nodded enthusiastically, as if she'd developed these ideas rather than simply agreeing. So many opportunities for forward-thinking companies, government contracts, private partnerships, the potential's enormous. Linda leaned forward, eyes brightening at profit mentions. When could this start generating income? Tommy looked troubled. Changing direction that drastically seems risky and expensive. Where would startup capital come from? David's smile carried patience for slow children. That's exactly the small thinking holding us back. Yes, it requires investment, but you spend money to make money. Whose money? Maggie asked quietly. Conversation stopped cold. David's fork paused. Ashley's smile flickered. Linda's enthusiasm dimmed. The company's money, obviously, David said. We'd liquidate assets, take loans against land, standard business practices. And who would manage this transition? Maggie asked. A management team, Ashley interjected before David could respond. People with modern business experience. No offense, Maggie, but bookkeeping skills from 30 years ago aren't adequate for today's marketplace. The insult was delivered with a smile, wrapped in corporate speak, but unmistakable. Maggie felt familiar dismissal, the assumption that her decades of experience counted for nothing against Ashley's 2 years of pharmaceutical sales. Timeline? Maggie asked evenly. David and Ashley exchanged rehearsed looks. They'd planned this conversation, coordinated arguments. The realization that her children had strategized against her hit like cold water. Fairly soon, David said casually. Maybe after New Year's. Time for everyone to adjust to new roles. New roles? Tommy's voice carried alarm. Linda shot him an irritated look. David means we'd all step up, take responsibility, instead of relying on Mom like we're still children? The irony was breathtaking. Linda, who called twice weekly for money, lecturing about not relying on their mother. David, who'd charged $5,000 to company accounts for personal expenses, discussing responsibility. And my new role? Maggie asked, though she suspected she knew. Another loaded glance. You've carried this burden so long, David said, with practiced sympathy. Time you enjoyed retirement. Really relax, pursue interests. Think of all you could do, Ashley added, suggesting generous gifts rather than forced removal. Travel, hobbies, time with friends. The presumption was staggering. They'd decided her future without consultation, packaged dismissal as reward, expected gratitude for being discarded. In her own dining room, after eating her meal, using casual family cruelty. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should discuss this more. Mom knows the business better than anyone. David's patience cracked. That's exactly the problem. She knows how things used to work. The world's changed. We need fresh perspectives. Clinging to the past won't save us. Clinging to the past, Maggie murmured, echoing Ashley's earlier dismissal of her home, her life. The dining room fell silent except for the grandfather clock's steady tick. 3 generations of family meals had been served here. Now that history was being rewritten, her contributions erased, her future decided by people who saw her as an obstacle. Linda broke silence with characteristic thoughtlessness. The important thing is smooth transition. We don't want complications. We're family, Ashley added with fake intimacy. We just want what's best for everyone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The word family hung like an accusation. These people who'd decided her fate without input, criticized her home, dismissed her contributions, they called themselves family while treating her like a problem to be solved. Maggie looked around the table at faces she'd loved for decades, searching for signs of the children she'd raised. Those children were gone, replaced by adults who measured relationships in utility and saw love as exploitable weakness. "This has certainly been illuminating," she said finally, voice carrying surprising calmness. After dishes were cleared and family scattered, Maggie sat alone in her kitchen with Eleanor's number highlighted on her screen. Some decisions, once made, couldn't be unmade. But sitting in the house where she'd raised 3 children who no longer saw her as anything more than inconvenient remnant, Maggie realized some foundations were beyond repair. Eleanor answered after 2 rings. "I was wondering when you'd call. How bad was it?" "Worse than expected," Maggie said quietly. "Eleanor, if you had power to teach someone an unforgettable lesson, but it would cost them everything they thought they wanted, would you do it?" Silence stretched long enough to hear the clock chiming 9. When Eleanor spoke, her voice carried hard-earned wisdom. "Depends on the lesson, and whether they'd learn from it." What if the lesson was that respect can't be demanded, only earned? "Then I'd say it's about time someone taught it to them." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning decades of friendship. Eleanor had watched Maggie sacrifice until nothing remained, seen dignity's slow erosion at hands of people who mistook kindness for weakness. "Eleanor," Maggie said, voice steadying with each word, "I think it's time I made some changes of my own." Maggie arrived at the office 40 minutes earlier than usual Monday morning, Eleanor's words from the night before echoing in her mind. The November air carried the bite of approaching winter, and frost clung to the company truck windshields like accusations. She needed time to think, to process the weekend's revelations in the quiet sanctuary of ledgers and familiar routines. The parking lot was empty except for her Honda, which suited her perfectly. She unlocked the office door and stepped into the cramped space that had been her second home for 35 years. The familiar smell of old paper and industrial coffee greeted her like an old friend who asked no questions and made no demands. She settled at her desk and opened the monthly reports, seeking comfort in numbers that behaved according to predictable rules. Unlike family relationships, accounting had clear principles. Debits and credits balanced, expenses were either justified or they weren't, and the bottom line told an honest story regardless of who wanted to hear something different. The trust fund quarterly statements lay in her locked desk drawer, waiting for her scheduled meeting with Jimmy Whitaker. 4,200,000 and change. The numbers had become so familiar she could recite them from memory, but this morning they carried new weight. This wasn't just money, it was power. Power her children didn't know existed, power that could solve every problem they complained about, power that had been secretly supporting their comfortable assumptions about family financial security for years. Her father-in-law's letter, written in his careful script and sealed with legal precision, had made his intentions clear. The money would remain hidden until his descendants proved worthy of the responsibility. At the time, Maggie had thought it was the eccentricity of an old man who'd worked too hard for too long. Now she understood it was the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough human nature to predict exactly how his son and grandchildren would behave, if they knew wealth was available without effort. The sound of car doors slamming interrupted her thoughts. Through the frosted office window, she could see David's BMW and Linda's aging SUV. Her children had never arrived at the office this early, and their presence together without prior notice sent alarm bells through her consciousness. Maggie moved quietly to the filing room, a narrow space between the main office and the warehouse where decades of company records created a maze of metal cabinets. From here, she could hear conversations in the office without being seen. A position she'd occupied more times than she cared to remember when David brought business associates, who spoke too freely about deals that skirted legal boundaries. "Told you this would be the perfect time," Ashley's voice carried clearly, through the thin walls. "She's still emotional from yesterday, more likely to agree if we present it as fait accompli." "I still think we should have included Tommy in this conversation," Linda said, though her tone suggested she was following a script rather than expressing genuine concern. "Tommy would just complicate things," David replied dismissively. "You know how he gets about protecting Mom's feelings. This is better handled between the three of us first." Maggie's hand found the edge of a filing cabinet for support. They were discussing her future again, but this time without even the pretense of including her in the decision-making process. "The important thing is controlling the timeline," Ashley continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd clearly thought through every detail. "If we give her too much time to think about it, she might start making difficulties. Better to present everything as already decided." "What about the retirement party?" Linda asked. "She's been expecting some kind of recognition ceremony." David's laugh was harsh enough to make Maggie flinch. "For what? Keeping books?" "Linda, we're not running a charity here. We can't afford to throw money around on sentimental gestures." "But people will expect something," Linda pressed. "It looks bad if we just dismiss her without any acknowledgement." "Fine," Ashley said with the impatience of someone solving a minor inconvenience. "We'll get a sheet cake from the grocery store, invite a few people for an hour after work. That should satisfy appearances without breaking the budget." The casual dismissal of 35 years of service hit Maggie like a physical blow. A grocery store cake, an hour after work. The retirement party she'd been quietly anticipating, not for the celebration itself, but for the recognition that her decades of sacrifice had mattered, reduced to the minimum gesture required for social propriety. "The real question," David continued, "is how quickly we can get her out of the office completely. I've already talked to that accounting firm in Charleston about taking over the books. They can have someone here by the end of the month." "You've already contacted replacements?" Linda's surprise seemed genuine. "Isn't that premature?" "It's called planning ahead," David replied with the condescension he'd perfected in childhood. "Something this family has never been particularly good at. We can't afford to waste time on sentimentality when there's real work to be done." Maggie pressed herself further back into the shadows as Ashley's footsteps approached the filing room. Through the gap between cabinets, she could see her daughter-in-law examining the company organizational chart hanging on the office wall. "This whole structure is outdated," Ashley said, tapping the chart with one manicured nail. "Look at this. She's got herself listed as Chief Financial Officer. For a company with 6 employees, it's embarrassing." "What would you change it to?" David asked. "Bookkeeper. That's what she actually is. All this CFO nonsense just inflates her sense of importance and makes it harder to implement necessary changes." The systematic dismantling of her professional identity continued with surgical precision. Not only were they planning to remove her from the business, they were retroactively diminishing her role, rewriting history to make her departure seem inevitable rather than forced. "There's another issue we need to address," Linda said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The money situation. David, you mentioned there might be family assets we could access once Mom steps back." Maggie's breath caught. They knew. Somehow they'd discovered the trust fund. I didn't say I knew about any specific assets, David replied carefully. But think about it logically. This family's been in coal for 3 generations. Granddad wasn't stupid. He had to have set something aside for emergencies. Mom's been managing the books all these years, and she's never seemed worried about money, even when times were tight. Relief flooded through Maggie as she realized they were speculating, not working from actual knowledge, but the speculation was dangerously close to the truth. So you think she's been hiding money from us? Ashley's voice carried excitement at the possibility of hidden wealth. Not hiding, David said. Managing, keeping it safe from our own. Poor financial decisions, which honestly was probably smart 20 years ago. But we're adults now. We should have access to family resources, especially if we're taking responsibility for the business. How much do you think we're talking about? Linda asked. Could be anything, David replied. Conservative coal families, especially the successful ones, they always kept emergency funds. Could be hundreds of thousands, maybe more. The irony was breathtaking. They were planning to force her into retirement specifically to gain access to money that existed only because of her careful management. Money they'd never earned, never contributed to, never even known existed until their greed made them start looking for it. The key is making sure the transition happens before she has time to relocate any assets, Ashley said delicately. Sometimes older people get paranoid about family members taking advantage. We want to make sure everything stays transparent and accessible. Maggie's hands clenched into fists. They weren't just planning to steal her dignity and dismiss her service. They were preparing to accuse her of financial impropriety if she didn't immediately hand over control of assets they had no legal claim to. That's why the retirement needs to happen quickly, David agreed. Clean break, immediate transition of all financial responsibilities. No lingering access, no gradual handover, just done. What if she refuses? Linda asked. The silence that followed was more chilling than any threat they could have spoken aloud. Finally, Ashley answered with the casual cruelty that had become her trademark. She won't refuse. Where would she go? What would she do? She's 64. Years old with no life outside this business and this family. She needs us more than we need her, and deep down, she knows it. The assessment was delivered with the clinical detachment of someone discussing livestock rather than a human being. Maggie realized that in Ashley's mind, she'd already been reduced to a problem to be managed rather than a person with feelings, rights, or dignity. Besides, David added, she's always been a team player. That's her weakness. She'll sacrifice anything for family unity. Even if she's unhappy with the decision, she'll go along with it rather than cause conflict. They knew her so well, knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, which guilts to leverage, which fears to exploit. 35 years of putting family harmony above personal needs had taught them that she was infinitely manipulable, endlessly willing to sacrifice her own interests for theirs. So we're agreed? Ashley asked. This afternoon, we present her with the retirement letter and the transition timeline. Clean, professional, final. Agreed, David said. Linda? I guess so, Linda replied with the weak reluctance that characterized all her participation in family decisions. I just hope she understands we're doing this for her own good. She will, Ashley said confidently. Eventually. Footsteps moved toward the office door, and Maggie pressed herself deeper into the filing room shadows. She heard the BMW and SUV start up and drive away, leaving her alone with the echo of their betrayal and the devastating clarity of her situation. They weren't just planning to force her retirement. They were planning to steal her identity, diminish her contributions, and then ransack the family assets she'd spent decades building and protecting. The children she'd raised, the family she'd sacrificed everything for, had become strangers who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle between them and money they'd never earned. But there was one crucial thing they'd gotten wrong in their calculations. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't dependent on their goodwill for her future. And most importantly, she wasn't the endlessly sacrificing martyr they thought they could manipulate with appeals to family unity. Maggie emerged from the filing room and walked slowly back to her desk. The trust fund documents seemed to pulse, with new significance in their locked drawer. $4 million that could disappear with a few signatures, redistributed to people who would appreciate it rather than exploit it. She picked up her phone and dialed Eleanor's number. "It's me," she said when her friend answered. "Remember what we talked about last night? About teaching lessons?" "I remember. I just overheard something that makes me think it's time for school to begin." Eleanor's chuckle carried dark satisfaction. "What did you have in mind?" Maggie looked around the cramped office where she'd spent 35 years building. A family legacy that her family intended to steal from her. "I'm thinking it's time they learned what family loyalty actually costs. And if they don't learn the lesson, then at least some good people will benefit from their ignorance." The words felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But for the first time in decades, Maggie felt the intoxicating sensation of choosing her own path rather than accommodating everyone else's demands. Her children wanted access to family money. She was about to make sure they got exactly what they'd earned. Eleanor's kitchen had become a war room by Tuesday evening. The familiar space with cheerful yellow walls now hosted conversations that would have shocked the quilting circle. Maggie sat with hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug while Eleanor moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone preparing for battle. "Tell me again what Ashley said about your title," Eleanor demanded, her teacher's instincts honing in on character-revealing details. "Chief Financial Officer for a company with 6 employees. It's embarrassing." Maggie's voice carried the flat tone of someone struck too many times to feel individual blows. Eleanor's jaw tightened. That little... She caught herself, remembering professional discipline. That woman doesn't understand what a CFO actually does, regardless of company size. Ashley's rewriting history to justify the present. And David orchestrated it. Eleanor settled across from her friend, studying Maggie's face with intensity once reserved for suspected cheaters. "How long have you known about the trust fund?" "Since Charles died. Jimmy Whittaker contacted me 3 months after the funeral." Maggie's voice strengthened in familiar territory. "The original trust was established in 1987, funded with mineral rights and coal investments. Charles Sr. was prescient about keeping it separate from operating business. And the children have no idea. None. Trust documents specify beneficiaries aren't informed until they demonstrate fiscal responsibility and moral character consistent with family values." Maggie's mouth quirked at the irony. Charles Sr. was very specific about criteria. Eleanor leaned back, processing implications. "How much?" $4.2 million as of last quarter. The number hung between them like a physical presence. Eleanor had taught 40 years in a town where families considered themselves fortunate with $400 emergency savings. The gap between perceived struggles and actual wealth was breathtaking. "You've been managing this alone for 35 years. Jimmy handles legal aspects, but yes. Investment decisions, distribution strategies, growth management." Quiet pride colored Maggie's exhaustion. "Original investment grew nearly 300% under my oversight." Eleanor whistled softly. "No wonder you never seemed worried. During bad years." "Not for myself," Maggie corrected quickly. "For them. Everything I did built their security, their children's futures. I thought they'd earn the right eventually. But they didn't." The simple statement carried 35 years of disappointment. Maggie stared into cold coffee, seeing reflections of conversations that never happened, gratitude never expressed, Respect, never earned. I kept thinking they'd grow up. That marriage, children, responsibility would teach them what I couldn't. She admitted the painful truth. That they'd understand the value of what they had. Some people never learn to value what they don't earn, Eleanor said gently. You can't teach gratitude to someone who's never experienced want. The observation stung because it indicted Maggie's parenting as much as her children's character. She'd given them such security that she'd robbed them of character-building struggles. The question now, Eleanor continued, is what you intend to do. Maggie met her friend's steady gaze. I know what I want to do. I'm just not sure it's right. Tell me. I want to dissolve the trust. Donate every penny to local charities that will actually help people. Let them discover exactly what their selfishness cost them. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something flickered. Satisfaction, perhaps, or long overdue vindication. And then? Then I want them to realize the mother they dismissed as a backward bookkeeper was the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. I want them to understand respect isn't demanded, it's earned. That's not revenge, Eleanor said quietly. That's justice. The distinction mattered more than expected. Revenge implied acting from anger. Justice suggested careful consideration, appropriate consequences, learning opportunities. But is it right? They're still my children. Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. What kind of children plan to force their mother into poverty? While stealing money she spent decades building? What kind of family celebrates 35 years with a grocery store cake? The words hit with surgical precision. Maggie had focused so intently on her moral obligations that she'd forgotten to consider theirs. Family loyalty was supposed to flow both ways. Besides, Eleanor continued, you're not taking anything away. You're simply not giving them something they never earned and don't deserve. There's a difference. Jimmy Whittaker might not see it that way. Jimmy's watched this family 20 years. He's seen exactly what you've seen. Eleanor's voice carried authority from observing human nature long enough to predict behavior. He's probably been waiting for you to reach this conclusion. Maggie considered this. Jimmy had never directly criticized her children, but his careful neutrality spoke volumes. His discretion might have been protecting her feelings as much as maintaining professional boundaries. There's something else, Eleanor said, leaning forward. If you don't act now, what happens? David will waste it on schemes. Linda will enable her husband's laziness. Ashley will spend it on status symbols. Within 5 years, it'll all be gone. The scenario was painfully plausible. $4 million sounded inexhaustible to people who'd never managed more than monthly paychecks, but irresponsible spending could drain even substantial accounts quickly. At least if you donate it, it'll do actual good. The food bank, library, community health clinic, these organizations stretch dollars and serve people who need help. Maggie found herself nodding. She'd worked with local charities for years, watching them perform miracles with minimal resources. Substantial endowments could transform their capabilities for generations. You've given your children every opportunity to prove themselves worthy, Eleanor said. They've chosen to demonstrate the opposite. At some point, you must accept that their character is their choice, not your responsibility. The liberation in that statement was overwhelming. For 35 years, Maggie had carried her children's failures as her own burden of maternal guilt. But Eleanor was right. She couldn't force them to be better people than they chose to be. What would the legal process look like? Maggie asked, surprising herself with the practical question. Eleanor's smile suggested she'd been waiting for this shift from emotional processing to tactical planning. Jimmy would know, but I imagine it's straightforward. The trust documents give you complete discretionary authority, right? Yes. As trustee, I can distribute or dissolve as I see fit, provided purposes align with original family values. Charitable giving certainly aligns with traditional family values. Maggie felt tension loosening in her chest. Weight carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't permanent. I should talk to Jimmy, understand all implications before making irreversible decisions. Good idea, but Maggie? Eleanor reached across, covering her friend's hand. Don't let legal technicalities override moral clarity. You know what's right. Trust that knowledge. They sat in comfortable silence, the decision settling between them like a bridge finally completed. Outside, November wind rattled windows. But inside Eleanor's kitchen, Maggie felt warmer than she had in decades. Are you prepared for their reactions? Eleanor asked eventually. David will be furious. Linda will manipulate with tears and guilt. Ashley will say things designed to hurt you deeply. Maggie considered this. Her children's anger had always been her weakness. She'd spent decades accommodating their moods, sacrificing her needs for family peace. But something fundamental had shifted. I've been afraid of their anger my whole life, she said slowly. Afraid of being the bad mother, the unreasonable one. But their happiness was built on my misery, and I finally understand that's not love. It's exploitation. Eleanor's proud smile reminded Maggie of classroom moments when struggling students finally grasped difficult concepts. Now you're thinking clearly. I'm scared. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life watching them waste everything I built while treating me like hired help. Fear's not bad, as long as it doesn't paralyze you. Being scared probably means you're taking this seriously enough to do it right. I'll call Jimmy tomorrow, Maggie said, words carrying commitment weight. Set up a meeting to review options. And I'll research local charities, Eleanor offered. Make sure we identify organizations that would use money wisely. As Maggie drove home through dark streets, she felt the strange lightness that comes from finally making a decision building for years. Tomorrow, she would begin dismantling her children's assumptions about family, money, and their place in the world. Tonight, she would sleep better than she had in decades, knowing she'd finally chosen her own dignity over their comfort. Tucker. Small Catholic church sat at the end of Main Street like a weathered sentinel, its modest steeple piercing gray November clouds that threatened early snow. Maggie pulled into the gravel parking lot Wednesday afternoon, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. Eleanor's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Sometimes you need spiritual counsel before making life-changing decisions. Father Miguel Santos was tending to the small garden beside the rectory when she approached, his dark hands gentle as he wrapped burlap around tender plants preparing for winter. At 45, he possessed the quiet strength of someone who'd chosen service over ambition, his presence radiating the kind of peace that came from alignment between beliefs and actions. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, straightening with a warm smile. This is a pleasant surprise. How can I help you? I need to talk to someone, Father, about family obligations and doing what's right. Her voice carried uncertainty that felt foreign after decades of confident decision-making. His expression shifted to gentle concern. Of course, come inside where it's warm. The church office was humble but welcoming, walls lined with books in both English and Spanish, a simple wooden cross hanging above a desk cluttered with community newsletters and assistance requests. Father Santos gestured to a comfortable chair while he settled behind his desk, hands folded in patient attention. What's troubling you? Maggie had rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless hours before dawn, but sitting in the priest's calming presence, her prepared words scattered like leaves in wind. Instead, she found herself speaking from raw honesty. My children are planning to force me into retirement. They want access to family money they don't know exists, and they're willing to destroy my dignity to get it. The words tumbled out faster as emotional pressure found release. I've spent 35 Years sacrificing for their comfort, and they see me as nothing more than an obstacle to their ambitions. Father Santos listened without interruption, his dark eyes reflecting compassion earned through years of hearing humanity's struggles. When Maggie finished her account of the overheard conversation and Ashley's cruel dismissals, he leaned back, thoughtfully. "And you're considering responding in kind?" "Not responding in kind," Maggie corrected quickly. "Responding appropriately. There's a family trust fund they don't know about. Money I've been managing and growing for decades. I'm thinking of dissolving it and donating everything to local charities instead of letting them inherit wealth they haven't earned." "Ah." Father Santos steepled his fingers, considering the moral complexity. "You're asking whether justice and charity can coexist." "I suppose I am." "Tell me about this trust fund. How much are we discussing?" $4.2 million. The priest's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained non-judgmental. "That's substantial. Life-changing money for your children and their families." "Yes, but also life-changing money for the community organizations that have been struggling to serve people in real need." Maggie's voice strengthened as she moved into familiar territory. "The food bank operates on a shoestring budget. The library's losing hours because they can't afford staff. The community health clinic turns people away because they lack resources." Father Santos nodded slowly. "I'm familiar with these challenges. I serve on the board of the Community Assistance Fund. We see the need daily." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly parishioner Maggie recognized from church potlucks, appeared in the doorway carrying a manila envelope. "Father, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is the documentation about my grandson's medical bills." "The ones we discussed?" "Of course, Mrs. Henderson. Come in." The woman entered hesitantly, her worn coat and worried expression telling a story of struggle that needed no words. She handed Father Santos the envelope, with shaking hands. "Tommy's leukemia treatments are costing more than we ever imagined. The insurance covers some, but the copays—" Her voice broke. "I hate asking for help, but we don't know where else to turn." Father Santos accepted the envelope with gentle dignity. "We'll review everything and see what assistance we can provide. The community fund exists for exactly these situations." After Mrs. Henderson left with promises of follow-up calls, Father Santos turned back to Maggie with meaningful weight. "That happens 3 or 4 times a week. Families facing impossible choices between medical care and basic necessities. The Community Assistance Fund helps, but our resources are limited." The timing felt providential. Maggie had just witnessed firsthand the gap between community needs and available resources, a gap that $4 million could bridge permanently. "Father, can I ask you something personal? Your parents immigrated from El Salvador, correct?" "Yes, they came with nothing but determination to build better lives for their children." "And you chose to serve here in Appalachia instead of a more prosperous parish. Why?" Father Santos smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose choices reflected his values. "Because this is where the need is greatest. Prosperity parishes have resources, connections, options. Rural communities like ours depend on people who choose to stay and serve. Even when it means sacrificing personal advancement? Especially then. Service without sacrifice isn't really service. It's just another form of self-interest." The words resonated through Maggie's bones. She'd spent 35 years serving her family without recognition or appreciation, but her sacrifice had enabled their selfishness rather than their growth. Perhaps true service meant knowing when to stop enabling destructive behavior. "Father, from a spiritual perspective, what's the difference between enabling someone and loving them?" Profound question. He considered carefully. "Love seeks the other's highest good, even when that requires difficult boundaries. Enabling seeks to avoid conflict, even when it perpetuates harmful patterns. And if someone you love is incapable of learning except through consequences, then providing those consequences might be the most loving thing you can do, not from anger or revenge, but from hope that pain might teach what comfort couldn't. The distinction clarified Maggie's swirling emotions. Her children's behavior had consequences. She simply hadn't allowed them to experience those consequences. Her protection had become their prison, her enabling their cage. There's another consideration, Father Santos continued. Stewardship. You've been entrusted with substantial resources. What does faithful stewardship require? Maggie thought about her father-in-law's trust document, his careful specifications about moral character and family values. The original trust was established with specific criteria about worthiness. The beneficiaries were supposed to demonstrate responsibility before inheriting. And have they? The question answered itself. David's reckless spending, Linda's manipulation, Ashley's casual cruelty, none of it reflected the values that had built the family fortune. They'd failed every test of character that mattered. No, they haven't. Then perhaps the trust funds should go to people who have demonstrated those values. People like Mrs. Henderson, who works 2 jobs to support her sick grandson. Organizations like the food bank, which serves hundreds of families without expectation or judgment. The rightness of it settled into Maggie's heart, like missing piece of puzzle finding its place. This wasn't about punishing her children. It was about rewarding virtue and supporting genuine need. Father, if I dissolve this trust and donate the money to local charities, am I betraying my obligations as a mother? Are you responsible for your children's character at this point in their lives? No. Are you responsible for using resources wisely and ethically? Yes. Then you have your answer. Father Santos leaned forward with gentle intensity. Maggie, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. Your children chose selfishness over gratitude, entitlement over responsibility. Those choices have costs. And if they never learn? If this just makes them bitter and angry? Then at least you'll know you tried to teach them, and you'll have the satisfaction of knowing the money went to people who will use it to serve others. The conversation was interrupted by another knock. Maria Gonzalez from the food bank, arriving for their scheduled meeting about holiday meal distributions. Father Santos introduced Maggie, and Maria's tired face brightened with recognition. Mrs. Caldwell, you've been so generous with the food bank over the years. Your donations have fed so many families. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. She'd been quietly supporting community organizations while her children complained about money and criticized her spending. Her backward bookkeeping had been feeding hungry families for years. After Maria left with promises of coordination, for holiday efforts, Father Santos returned to their conversation with renewed purpose. You've already been practicing the kind of stewardship I'm talking about. The difference now is scale and permanence. And publicity, Maggie added quietly. My children will know what I've done. Good. Perhaps public accountability will accomplish what private generosity couldn't. As their conversation wound down, Father Santos offered one final perspective. Maggie, your children see you as weak because you've absorbed their cruelty without consequence. They mistake your kindness for powerlessness. Sometimes revealing your strength is necessary for everyone's spiritual health. Walking back to her car as late afternoon shadows lengthened across the church parking lot, Maggie felt the peace that comes from moral clarity. Her decision was no longer about anger or revenge. It was about faithful stewardship, appropriate consequences, and choosing service over enabling. Tomorrow, she would call Jimmy Whitaker and begin the legal process of redistributing her family's wealth to people who would honor its purpose. Tonight, She would pray for her children's souls and the wisdom to remain strong in the face of their inevitable fury. Some lessons could only be learned through loss, and some love could only be expressed through consequences. After 35 years of protecting her children from their own choices, it was time to let them discover what character actually cost. Jimmy Whittaker's law office occupied the second floor of a Victorian building that had weathered 90 years with stubborn dignity. The wooden stairs creaked under Maggie's feet Thursday morning as she climbed toward a conversation that would validate her decision or reveal unexpected obstacles. "Maggie," Jimmy said, rising with old-school courtesy. "You sounded urgent on the phone." "I'm considering trust dissolution and charitable distribution." She settled into the familiar leather chair, hands folded to hide their trembling. Jimmy's eyebrows rose fractionally, his only sign of surprise. He studied her face with intensity once reserved for hostile witnesses. "What's prompted this?" She recounted the family dinner, the overheard conversation, Ashley's cruelty, David's retirement plans. Jimmy listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. "Before we discuss legal mechanisms," he said finally, "I need to share something I've been waiting 35 years to reveal." He moved to an antique safe, withdrawing a manila envelope sealed with red wax. "Your father-in-law left specific instructions. This letter was to be opened only if you expressed interest in dissolution or if his family proved unworthy of inheritance." Maggie accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The wax bore the Caldwell family crest, coal pick, crossed with Bible. She broke the seal and unfolded pages in Charles Sr.'s familiar handwriting. "My dear Margaret, if you're reading this, my fears about my son's character have been realized, and my grandchildren have followed his example rather than your guidance. This trust was never intended to reward entitlement. It was meant to secure the future of family members who honored our values: hard work, community service, fiscal responsibility, and gratitude. If my descendants have failed these tests, I want the money to go where it will do genuine good. You know this community's needs better than anyone. Use your judgment. You are not betraying family loyalty by making this choice. You are honoring the true meaning of family, people who care for each other through sacrifice, not those who demand sacrifice while offering nothing. Do not feel guilty. You have given them every opportunity to earn this inheritance. If they chose selfishness over service, that choice was theirs alone. Your loving father-in-law, Charles Caldwell Sr." Tears blurred Maggie's vision. Charles Sr. had understood, had predicted, exactly what would happen. "The legal structure is straightforward," Jimmy continued gently. "Charles designed the trust with broad, discretionary powers specifically for this situation. You can dissolve everything and redirect all assets with a single signature. No court approval, no family consent, no waiting periods. Tax implications? Charitable donations. This size provides substantial benefits. The trust structure optimizes tax efficiency of charitable giving." He thought of everything. "My children can't contest this?" "None whatsoever. Trust documents explicitly state beneficiaries have no vested interest until actual distribution. They have no legal standing to challenge your decisions." Jimmy removed his glasses, cleaning them carefully. "Maggie, I've watched 3 generations of this family. Your father-in-law was a man of genuine integrity. Your children have lived assuming someone else would solve their problems and fund their mistakes. And Ashley? Ashley sees your family as a bank account with marriage benefits." Jimmy withdrew a thick folder. "I've kept dissolution paperwork current, updated quarterly. If you're certain, we can execute everything today." "Today?" Charles was specific about timing. He didn't want you enduring prolonged family pressure once you'd made this choice. Maggie looked at paperwork that would transform everything. "Jimmy, am I doing this from anger or love? You don't have the capacity for cruelty. Everything you've done has been motivated by love. sometimes misguided love that enabled bad behavior, but always love. This continues that pattern. How? Because you're finally loving them enough to let them learn from mistakes, and loving this community enough to put resources where they'll do genuine good. Maggie reached for the pen, her hand steady with newfound certainty. Where do I sign? As her signature flowed across documents that would reshape her world, Maggie felt profound peace from aligning actions with principles. Her children were about to learn that character had consequences, and her community was about to discover what $4 million could accomplish in hands that understood service. Maggie's hands were still steady from signing the dissolution papers when she pulled into her driveway Friday afternoon. But the sight of David's BMW, Linda's SUV, and Ashley's leased Mercedes clustered like vultures around her front porch made her stomach clench. They were early, 2 hours before she'd expected them for what David had called a family business meeting. Through her kitchen window, she could see them inside her house, moving with the casual entitlement of people who'd already decided the outcome of conversations they hadn't yet had. David stood at her desk rifling through papers, while Ashley sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open, typing with the focused intensity of someone creating official documents. Linda hovered nervously between them, wringing her hands but making no move to object to their invasion of privacy. Maggie entered through her own front door like a stranger in her own home. "There you are," David said, without looking up from her personal correspondence. "We were wondering when you'd get back. Ashley's been working on your retirement transition documents." Ashley glanced up with a smile that managed to be both patronizing and predatory. "I hope you don't mind, Maggie. We let ourselves in with the spare key. David thought it would be more efficient to get everything prepared before you arrived." The casual violation of her privacy was breathtaking. They'd entered her home without permission, gone through her private papers, and were now presenting their invasion as a thoughtful gesture. Maggie set her purse down carefully, using the moment to steady herself for what was coming. "What kind of transition documents?" "Nothing complicated," Ashley said, turning the laptop screen toward her. "Just a simple retirement letter announcing your decision to step back from daily operations, effective immediately. I've also prepared a transition timeline for transferring all financial responsibilities to more qualified personnel." Maggie read the screen with growing disbelief. The letter was written in her voice but contained words she'd never spoken, sentiments she'd never expressed. It painted her retirement as a voluntary decision motivated by her desire to enjoy her golden years, and her recognition that the business requires more modern expertise than my traditional bookkeeping skills can provide. "You wrote a retirement letter for me?" "Well, you're not exactly a wordsmith," Ashley said with casual cruelty. "This version sounds more professional, more appropriate for someone stepping aside gracefully." David finally looked up from her desk, holding a manila folder that Maggie recognized as containing her insurance policies and personal financial records. "Mom, we need to discuss your asset transition as well, for tax purposes and estate planning." "My assets? Don't play." "Dumb," David said with impatience that had been building for days. "We know there's family money you've been managing. It's time for full transparency about our financial position." Linda shifted uncomfortably, finally speaking up with the weak voice of someone who knew she was participating in something wrong, but lacked the courage to object. "David, maybe we should ease into this conversation more gradually." "There's no point in easing into anything," Ashley interjected. "We're all adults here. Maggie knows this transition is necessary, and we know she's been managing resources that rightfully belong to the whole family." The assumption of guilt was staggering. They were accusing her of financial impropriety while simultaneously stealing her personal documents and forging retirement letters in her name. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so vicious. "Where's Tommy?" Maggie asked quietly. "We decided this conversation was better handled without Tommy's emotional complications," David replied dismissively. "He gets too sentimental." about family dynamics to focus on business necessities. Tommy works here. This affects his livelihood, too. Tommy will be fine, Ashley said with the confidence of someone who'd never worried about anyone else's employment. We'll find him an appropriate role in the new structure, probably something less demanding than his current responsibilities. The casual dismissal of Tommy's years of dedication completed the picture. They weren't just forcing her out, they were restructuring the entire business around their own limitations and preferences, with no regard for anyone else's contributions or needs. David set down her personal papers and approached with the folder of documents Ashley had prepared. Mom, I need you to sign these papers: the retirement letter, the financial transition forms, and a few other administrative items. Maggie looked at the documents without taking them. And if I refuse? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. David's face flushed red. Ashley's smile became sharp enough to cut glass, and Linda took a step backward as if physical distance could protect her from the confrontation she'd helped create. Why would you refuse? Ashley asked with dangerous sweetness. Unless you're planning to be difficult about this transition. I'm planning to make my own decisions about my own life, Maggie replied evenly. David's patience finally snapped. Completely. For God's sake, Mom, stop being so dramatic. You're 64 years old. You should be grateful we're giving you a dignified way to step aside instead of just replacing you outright. Replacing me with whom? With people who understand modern business practices, Ashley said. People who aren't stuck in 1985 thinking that handwritten ledgers and personal relationships are adequate for today's marketplace. The dismissal of everything Maggie had built and maintained cut deeper than any personal insult. They weren't just attacking her, they were erasing her legacy, rewriting 35 years of success as outdated incompetence. And you've already made these arrangements? We've had preliminary conversations, David admitted. Nothing final until you sign the transition documents. I see. Maggie looked around her kitchen at the three people who'd invaded her home, violated her privacy, and were now demanding she sign away her dignity with a smile. And my retirement party? Ashley's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Oh, we thought we'd keep that simple. Maybe a sheet cake after work next Friday. Just something small and appropriate. 35 years of service. Reduced to a sheet cake and called appropriate. Maggie walked to her kitchen counter and picked up the phone. David's eyes narrowed as she dialed a number from memory. Eleanor? It's me. Could you come over? I have some guests who I think are ready to leave. She hung up and turned back to her children with a smile that carried 35 years of suppressed steel. You know what? I've changed my mind about retirement. I think I'll stay exactly where I am for as long as I choose. David's face went from red to purple. You can't just... Actually, I can. This is my house, my business, and my decision. And right now, I'm deciding that you need to leave. Ashley stood up so fast her chair fell backward. You're making a huge mistake, Maggie. We're offering you a graceful exit. If you force us to take other measures... What other measures? Maggie's voice carried a calm that made all three of them step back. Please, enlighten me about what other measures you think you can take. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of Eleanor's car pulling into the driveway and footsteps approaching the front door. David, Linda, and Ashley suddenly looked like what they were, trespassers who'd been caught in the act of stealing. We'll discuss this later, David said, grabbing his papers with hands that shook slightly. When you're being more reasonable. We'll discuss it whenever I decide we'll discuss it, Maggie replied. And next time you'll wait for an invitation before entering my home. As her children and Ashley fled past Eleanor at the front door, Maggie felt the last chains of misplaced family loyalty finally breaking. They'd shown her exactly who they were, and she'd finally found the courage to believe them. Eleanor closed the door behind the retreating family, and turned to Maggie with a grin that could have powered the town for a week. "So," she said, "how did the papers go with Jimmy?" Maggie's smile was peaceful as mountain morning. "Signed, sealed, and delivered. $4.2 million is now working for people who actually deserve it." "And how long before they figure out what they've lost?" "Probably Monday morning when the bank calls about the closed accounts." Eleanor's laughter filled the kitchen like sunlight after storm. "This is going to be interesting." Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of November day that made mountains look like watercolor paintings. Maggie woke with the energized purpose of someone who'd finally stopped fighting the current and decided to swim with it instead. Today, $4 million would find its way to people who understood service rather than entitlement. Eleanor arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, with coffee and a manila folder thick with research. "I spent all night making lists," she announced, spreading papers across Maggie's kitchen table. "Every worthy organization in this county, their current needs, and their capacity to handle substantial donations responsibly." They worked methodically through Eleanor's research. The food bank, currently operating from a cramped church basement, could expand to serve 3 counties with proper facilities and equipment. The community health clinic, turning away patients weekly due to lack of resources, could hire additional staff and extend hours. The library, facing closure due to budget cuts, could not only survive but establish educational programs for struggling students. "What about individual families?" Maggie asked, thinking of Mrs. Henderson and her grandson's medical bills. Father Santos maintains a discretionary assistance fund for emergency situations. A substantial contribution there would help families facing catastrophic expenses without creating dependency. By 10 o'clock, they had distribution amounts, calculated with the precision Maggie applied to business ledgers. The largest portion, $1.5 million, would establish permanent endowments for the food bank and health clinic. Another $1 million would create educational scholarships administered through the library. The remaining funds would support smaller organizations, the volunteer fire department, senior services, and Father Santos's emergency assistance fund. "Time to make some calls," Eleanor said, consulting her list of contact numbers. The conversations that followed were surreal. In their joy, Sarah Martinez from the food bank burst into tears when Maggie explained the endowment amount. Dr. Patricia Chen from the health clinic was speechless for a full minute before asking if this was some kind of prank. The library director, Mrs. Foster, had to sit down when she heard about the scholarship fund. Each conversation ended the same way. "We can't thank you enough, and this will change everything for our community." By noon, they'd contacted every organization on their list. Father Santos arrived to help coordinate the formal presentations and legal documentation, his face glowing with the satisfaction of prayers answered beyond expectation. "The bank will need proper documentation for transfers this large," he said, reviewing their distribution list. "But Jimmy Whitaker assured me everything is prepared for immediate processing." "How long before the community knows?" Maggie asked. "Word's already spreading," Eleanor replied with satisfaction. "Small towns don't keep secrets this good. By Monday, everyone will know someone saved half the organizations in the county." "And by Monday," Father Santos added gently, "your children will discover what they lost through their selfishness." Maggie felt no satisfaction in that prospect, only sadness for the people they might have been if they'd chosen differently. But her children's character was their responsibility now, not hers. The afternoon was spent with representatives from each organization, signing formal agreements and establishing endowment structures. Jimmy Whitaker arrived with legal documents that transformed emotional decisions into binding commitments. Each signature felt like freedom, money that had been trapped by family dysfunction now flowing toward genuine need. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope and vindication, Maggie stood in her kitchen surrounded by people who understood service. Tomorrow, her children would discover that respect couldn't be demanded, inheritance couldn't be assumed, and some bridges once burned illuminated exactly what should have mattered all along. The revolution was complete. $4 million had moved from private greed to public good, and a quiet bookkeeper had finally found her voice. The real education was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the deceptive calm of a sky, before lightning strikes. Maggie sat at her desk in the Caldwell Coal Company office, reviewing routine paperwork with the strange lightness of someone who'd finally set down a burden she'd carried too long. The trust fund documents were gone from her locked drawer, replaced by thank you cards from organizations still processing their sudden good fortune. At 9:47 a.m., David's phone rang in his makeshift office down the hall. From her desk, Maggie could hear his confident David Caldwell speaking, followed by a silence that stretched long enough to make her look up from her ledgers. "What do you mean, closed?" David's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd just run into an unexpected wall. "That account has been active for decades. There must be some mistake." Another pause. Maggie could hear David's chair creaking. As he shifted, his voice rising with each word. "No, I'm not the account holder, but I'm family. My mother, Margaret Caldwell, has been managing." "What do you mean, at the client's request?" The silence that followed was broken by the sound of David's phone hitting his desk with enough force to rattle the windows. Within seconds, footsteps pounded down the narrow hallway that separated their offices. "Mom?" David burst through her doorway without knocking, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something approaching panic. "I just got a call from First National. They're saying the family trust account has been closed and emptied." Maggie continued writing in her ledger, her handwriting steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Is that so?" "Don't play games with me." David's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Where's the money? What did you do with the family money?" "What family money?" Maggie asked mildly, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "I thought you said this family didn't have any hidden assets. Wasn't that what you told Ashley?" "That I was just an old woman with backward bookkeeping skills?" David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he processed the implications. Behind him, Linda appeared in the doorway, her face pale with the expression of someone who'd just received very bad news. "The bank called me too," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said all family accounts associated with the trust have been closed. David, how much money are we talking about?" "I don't know," David exploded, spinning to face his sister. "I didn't even know there was money until Friday, and now Mom's done something with it." $4.2 million, Maggie said quietly. The number landed in the cramped office like a physical blow. Linda staggered backward until she hit the doorframe. David's face went from red to white to green in the span of 3 seconds. $4 million? Linda's voice was barely audible. "0.2, Maggie added helpfully. "I've always been precise with numbers. It's part of that backward bookkeeping you all find so embarrassing." Ashley's voice echoed from the parking lot before her heels clicked rapidly across the office. Floors. She appeared behind Linda wearing the expression of someone who'd just discovered a fire in her house. "David, what the hell is going on? I just got 3 calls from people saying your family donated millions to local charities. Please tell me this is some kind of sick joke." The word "donated" hit David like a slap. His eyes widened as he finally understood the scope of what had happened. "You gave it away. You gave away $4 million. I distributed it according to the original trust intentions," Maggie corrected. "Your grandfather wanted the money to go to people who demonstrated moral character and community service. I simply followed his wishes." "His wishes?" Ashley's voice rose to a shriek. "What about our wishes? What about David's plans for the business? What about the money we were counting on?" You were counting on money you didn't know existed until Friday, Maggie observed. How does one count on unknown resources? David slammed his fist on her desk hard enough to make her coffee cup jump. You had no right. That money belonged to this family. That money belonged to people who earned it through character and service, Maggie replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd finally found solid ground. None of you qualified. This is insane! Ashley spun toward Linda. Can't we contest this? Sue for financial fraud or elder abuse or something? Linda, who'd been staring at the floor in shell-shocked silence, finally looked up with tears streaming down her face. Mom, how could you do this to us? We're your children. We needed that money. For what? Maggie asked. David needed it to fund more failed business schemes? You needed it to enable Mark's unemployment and your children's entitled attitudes? Ashley needed it to maintain a lifestyle she never earned? We needed it for security, Linda sobbed. For our futures, for the kids' college funds, for everything you never worked for and never appreciated, Maggie finished. Linda, I've been giving you money for 15 years, thousands and thousands of dollars that you never acknowledged and never repaid. Where did that security get you? Tommy's voice from the doorway was barely audible. Mom, what's happening? Maggie's heart broke a little at the confusion and hurt in her youngest son's voice. Of all her children, Tommy was the only one who'd never demanded anything, never accused her of withholding resources, never treated her like hired help. Tommy, I distributed the family trust fund to local charities, organizations that serve the community instead of exploiting it. Tommy stepped into the office, taking in his siblings' faces, the tension radiating from Ashley, the papers scattered across Maggie's desk. How much? Over $4 million, David said flatly. Tommy whistled softly, then looked at his mother with something approaching admiration. Good for you, Mom. Good for her? Ashley whirled on Tommy like a striking, Sink, she just threw away your inheritance, your children's future. How is that good? Because my children will learn to work for what they want instead of waiting for handouts, Tommy said quietly. Because maybe now David will have to actually learn how to run a business instead of assuming money will solve his problems. David's face went purple with rage. You sanctimonious little— Stop. Maggie's voice cut through the building hysteria with surprising authority. All of you, this conversation is over. Over? Ashley laughed with bitter hysteria. This conversation is just beginning. We're going to fight this, Maggie. We're going to drag you through every court in the state until— Until what? Maggie stood up, her small frame somehow filling the room with presence that made all four of them step back. Until you prove that you deserved money you never knew existed? Until you demonstrate the character that would have earned you the inheritance in the first place? She walked around her desk to face them directly. You spent Friday trying to force me into retirement with a grocery store sheet cake after 35 years of service. You wrote resignation letters in my name, invaded my home, went through my private papers, and planned to steal assets you had no legal claim to. And now you're outraged that I chose to give that money to people who actually serve others? The silence that followed was deafening. Even Ashley seemed to realize that any legal challenge would require them to explain their own behavior under oath. The food bank will now serve 3 counties instead of struggling to feed one, Maggie continued. The health clinic can hire doctors and stay open evenings. Children will get scholarships to college based on merit instead of entitlement. Families facing medical emergencies will get help instead of bankruptcy. She looked at each of her children in turn. $4 million is now working to build this community instead of enabling your selfishness. That's not a tragedy. That's justice. David's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. You've destroyed this family. No, Maggie said sadly. You destroyed this family when you decided I was an obstacle instead of your mother. I just stopped, pretending otherwise. 6 months later, Maggie stood before the gleaming Margaret Caldwell Community Center, watching as Eleanor cut the red ribbon with ceremonial scissors, while a crowd of 300 neighbors applauded. The spring air carried the scent of fresh construction and blooming dogwoods, but more importantly, it carried the sound of genuine gratitude from people whose lives had been transformed by a quiet bookkeeper's moment of moral courage. The community center was just the beginning. Through the large windows, Maggie could see the expanded food bank where volunteers sorted donations that now served families across 3 counties. Sarah Martinez, the director, had told her just that morning that they'd distributed more meals in the past 6 months than in the previous 3 years combined. Dr. Patricia Chen approached from the health clinic's new wing, her smile bright, enough to power the building. "Mrs. Caldwell, I wanted you to see this," she said, holding up a photo of a young mother holding a healthy baby. "Maria's diabetes would have gone untreated without our expanded services. This little one might not have made it." Maggie accepted the photo with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the overwhelming weight of impact she'd never expected to witness directly. For 35 years, she'd managed numbers in ledgers. Now those numbers had faces, names, futures that extended far beyond quarterly reports. "The scholarship committee announced this year's recipients yesterday," Mrs. Foster from the library said, joining their small circle. 18 high school seniors will attend college this fall, including 3 who would have gone straight to work in the mines. You've changed the trajectory of entire families. The scholarship fund had been Eleanor's idea, education as the foundation for breaking cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. Watching teenage faces light up with possibility had become Maggie's favorite part of this new life she'd created from the ashes of family disappointment. Father Santos approached through the crowd, his clerical collar somehow managing to look both formal and approachable above his broad smile. "The Emergency Assistance Fund helped its 50th family this week," he reported. "Mrs. Henderson's grandson finished his cancer treatments, and the family didn't lose their home to medical bills." The ripple effects continued to surprise Maggie. Money that might have enabled her children's worst impulses was instead catching families before they fell through society's cracks. Every success story felt like vindication of a decision that had cost her personally, but gained her something more valuable: the knowledge that her life's work finally served a worthy purpose. "Mom?" Maggie turned to find Tommy standing nearby, his work clothes clean, but bearing the honest marks of someone who'd spent the day managing actual business operations. In the 6 months since her revelation, Tommy had stepped into responsibilities he'd never been allowed to shoulder, learning to make decisions without David's interference or Linda's manipulation. "How's Katie doing with the changes?" Maggie asked, genuinely concerned about her granddaughter's adjustment to the family upheaval. Tommy's smile was the first genuinely peaceful expression she'd seen from him in years. "Better than I expected. She's proud of what you did, Mom. At school, when kids talk about the new programs and scholarships, she tells them her grandmother made it happen." The pride in his voice was worth more than any thank you letter or community recognition. Tommy had initially struggled with the financial loss, not from greed, but from the security he'd imagined it represented. But watching him grow into genuine leadership had been one of the unexpected gifts of her decision. And the business? Surviving. Actually thriving, now that I'm making decisions based on reality instead of David's fantasies. Tommy's confidence had grown along with his responsibilities. Turns out the coal industry isn't dead. It just needed someone who understood the difference between adapting and abandoning core principles. As if summoned by their conversation, David's BMW pulled into the community center parking lot. Maggie felt the familiar tightness in her chest, followed immediately by the newer strength that reminded her she no longer had to manage other people's emotions. David emerged from his car looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 6 months. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat that had settled into his posture, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who'd finally realized the scope of his losses. He approached slowly, his steps uncertain in a way that would have broken Maggie's heart 6 months ago. Now it simply made her sad for the man he might have been if he'd chosen differently. "Mom," he said quietly, "I heard about the ceremony. Thought I should congratulate you." The words came out stilted, rehearsed, but Maggie recognized the effort they represented. David's pride had been shattered completely when Ashley left him for a Charleston businessman with actual liquid assets. The humiliation of watching his wife abandon him for exactly the kind of wealth he'd assumed was his birthright had apparently prompted some uncomfortable self-reflection. "Thank you," Maggie replied simply. She didn't offer forgiveness. That would need to be earned, but she didn't reject his attempt at reconciliation either. "I've been thinking about what you said, about character and consequences." David's voice was barely audible above the celebration around them. I think I understand now why Granddad set up the trust the way he did." It was the closest David had ever come to acknowledging that the money's distribution reflected their behavior rather than her vindictiveness. The admission cost him visible effort, but it was a beginning. "Understanding is the first step," Maggie said gently. "What matters now is what you do with that understanding." Linda remained notably absent from the celebration, still trapped in the victim narrative that painted Maggie's decision as inexplicable cruelty rather than inevitable consequence. But Maggie had learned to accept that some people would never grow beyond their grievances. As the formal ceremony concluded and neighbors began drifting toward the reception tables loaded with potluck contributions, Eleanor appeared at Maggie's elbow with the satisfied expression of a teacher whose most challenging student had finally mastered a difficult lesson. "So," Eleanor said, surveying the transformed landscape of their small community, "any regrets?" Maggie looked around at the faces of people whose lives had been changed by her decision. Children who would attend college, families who wouldn't lose homes to medical debt, seniors who could afford both medicine and groceries. She thought about Tommy's growth, David's possible redemption, and her own journey from invisible family servant to respected community leader. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret waiting so long to find my backbone." Eleanor's laughter carried across the parking lot like music. "Well, better late than never. Besides, backbone improves with age, like fine wine and good cheese." As the spring evening settled over the mountains that had sheltered her family, for 3 generations Maggie felt the deep satisfaction that comes from aligning actions with values. The money was gone, but in its place was something more valuable. A legacy built on service rather than entitlement, community rather than exploitation, and love that demanded growth rather than enabling stagnation. Her children had wanted easy wealth. Instead, they'd received the harder gift of consequences that might eventually teach them wisdom. The community had received resources that would serve families for generations, and Maggie had finally learned that respect couldn't be demanded. Inheritance couldn't be assumed, and some bridges were meant to be burned to illuminate what truly mattered. Standing in the parking lot of a community center that bore her name but served everyone, Maggie understood that this was what legacy actually looked like. Not money hoarded for unworthy heirs, but impact that rippled through generations of people who understood the difference between privilege and purpose. The foundation she'd built from the ruins of family expectations would outlast them all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.